welcome, croeso I Harlech. Welcome to Harlech, and more precisely, Harlech Castle. Castell Harlech. Castell being the Welsh word for castle. Harlech is a beautiful town in Gwynedd. Obviously it's got the castle. It's got the second steepest road in the world. I'm going to very tentatively say that because I'll talk to you again about the steepest road, or possibly not. The Cambrian coastline runs through here. The castle is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I'll tell you a little bit about the castle. Obviously, as with many castles in Wales, it's had quite a changeable history with the English and the Welsh and so on in invading and so on. It was built in 1283. It was built fast, it was built strong. It's an amazing vantage point across the plains and the valleys and the hills. It was built in 1283 by Edward I at a cost of just under £9,000. Other notable resident, Owain Glyndŵr, who we met in Machynlleth. Owain Glyndŵr took this castle. I believe there'd been another unsuccessful Welsh uprising beforehand, but Owain Glyndŵr actually took it in 1404, late 1404, early 1405, and he held parliament here. He held it in Machynlleth, he also held his parliament here, and he held it until 1409. So after that, it was involved in the War of Roses. I'm not quite sure on the link between this castle and the War of the Roses, but I know it was involved, and it was occupied by the English and the Welsh for many years from then. So the Mabinogion is possibly the most well-known Welsh book in the world. It was translated from Middle English. It's had many translations over the years, and they are amazing stories. And one of the stories that I remember the best, I think I was probably about 8 years old when I was first told it, is the story of Branwen and Geadvran. Now, Branwen and Geadvran were the son and daughter of Llyr, king of all the Britons. And it's important to note that Geadvran was a giant. Now this was Geadvran's castle, or at least something on this site was Geadvran's castle, if you're a believer. And one day, the Welsh soldiers looked out to sea, and they saw the Irish ships heading across the water. And of course they were frightened, but they realised that they were flying the flag of peace. The reason that they'd come over was because Matholwch, the Irish king, wanted to marry Branwen. So he asked Geadvran for Branwen's hand in marriage. And Geadvran accepted. And they had a wonderful celebration. But during the celebration, Efnisien, who was the half-brother of Branwen and Geadvran, decided that he would, because he was jealous that he hadn't been asked about Branwen's hand, decided that he would mutilate and kill the Irish horses. So there was much upset, and Matholwch was enraged, and he didn't want to marry Branwen, and he wanted to fight with the Welsh. But Geadvran did his best and spoke to him and offered him new horses and a cauldron that brought the dead back to life. So Matholwch and Branwen headed out across the waters to Ireland, and they lived happily for a little while, and they had a son called Gwynedd. But it wasn't to last, because the Irish people called on Matholwch to do something about Branwen and her family because of the outrage of what had happened to the horses. So Matholwch sent her down to the servants' quarters and kept her in the kitchen, and she was miserable. So she was locked up, and she was looking for a way to communicate with her brother and tell him of her plight. And she managed to talk to a starling and coach this starling to the extent that it went and told Geadvran what had happened. Geadvran heard about Branwen's plight, and he went across the sea. He was so tall that his head stuck above the water, and the Irish wondered what on earth was approaching, but it was of course Geadvran. Now, Geadvran, there was a big river to cross, and he laid himself across the river, and his troops walked across him, and when they saw this show of strength, the Irish decided that they weren't going to fight. So Matholwch and Geadvran were in discussions, but it wasn't real. There was a trick, because Matholwch built Geadvran a house, but within the house were hundreds upon hundreds of Irish troops. Now Efnisien once again got involved, and he crushed the skulls of the Irish troops, which enraged them. So there was a big battle between the Irish and the Welsh, and many were killed, including, sadly, Geadvran. Only he didn't die. They believed that your soul was contained in your head. He asked his men to cut his head off, and his head actually lived. I believe it was for 15 years more, and there's more to that story, but I'm sure we can save that for another day. Now Branwen and Geadvran's head came back to Wales, but poor Branwen, because unfortunately during the battles, Gwern, her son, had been killed by, guess who? A Visnien. He threw him into a fire. She'd lost her son and she'd lost her brother, and so poor Branwen died of a broken heart. So why Harlech? Harlech can be split into two words, ardd, meaning high, and llech, meaning rock. Now you can understand where that etymology comes from, because here we are up on a very high rock. Now originally, as you can see the sea over there, the sea came up to the castle. There were actually steps leading down to the sea. So it was a perfect standpoint from strategical point of view, because the boats could sail right up. But I'm not entirely sure, but it's obviously over the past few hundred years why the sea has moved back. And looking at Harlech itself, you have the old town at the top just here, and then the new town down at the bottom. Another version of Harlech, because of course it's translation, things do get lost in translation, is possibly that it could be fair rock. So it's either high rock or fair rock. Either would work. It is beautiful up here. Absolutely stunning views. And there we have the Cambrian coastline. I mentioned it in my Machynlleth video. If you ever get the opportunity to take the Cambrian coastline, do, because this is what you're following. It's absolutely stunning. So Harlech has been home to many poets, composers, and so on. And one of note is Philip Pullman. He actually went to Ysgol ar Dydwy just down there. He started his life elsewhere. His father, I believe, was in the RAF, so he travelled a lot. And I think he spent time in Rhodesia. But his formative years were spent here, and he went to Ysgol ar Dydwy. Philip Pullman, if you don't know, is the celebrated author of His Dark Materials. Cool noise, though. Ooh, that's really dark. Wow, we've just climbed the prison tower. That is a good workout. Well, this wouldn't be a Miss HubNut video without talking about food. And the cafe just here is absolutely lovely. We've just stopped by. It's absolutely freezing, so we wanted something that would stick to your ribs. So we had goulash. It was absolutely gorgeous. A massive bowl with beautiful whole wheat bloomer and butter, of course. And it was full of meat and vegetables, absolutely delicious. And very reasonably priced as well. The only unfortunate thing, the only complaint is that we were too full to eat cake. And they had some exceptional looking chocolate and blueberry vegan cake in there. So I'm most upset that we missed that. And poor Mr. HubNut is nodding furiously behind the camera because he didn't get a piece of Victoria sponge either. However, we have just walked up 50 million stairs, so I think we could probably at some point take the opportunity to get some cake. Maybe we'll pop back in, or maybe we'll go elsewhere, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, absolutely worth a visit. Very reasonably priced actually to come around this castle. I think it was £7.40 for an adult. And there's a gift shop, there's lots of little exhibits and so on. Definitely worth a visit. And a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well. So one of Harlech's claim to fame is that it has the steepest street in the world. Fort Penllech, which is just here, is supposed to be the steepest street in the world with a gradient of 37.45. However, this was contested by a town in New Zealand and a street called Baldwin Street because of the way they were measured. Now, the street called Baldwin Street in New Zealand is very straight, and Fort Penllech, as you can see, is not. So they had to think about the way that they measured the street. Now they were going down the side of the street, which gave this street the gradient of 37.45 and gave Baldwin Street a gradient of 34.4. When they remeasured, they decided that they should use the middle of the road, which gave this street a gradient of 28.6 and kept Baldwin's 34.4. So the title has actually gone over to New Zealand. But what an amazing little street to drive. It's really quite hairy in places, extremely steep. So we're just walking through Harlech town. It's lovely, lots of crafty shops, little galleries, cafes that you could pop into. Really nice place to walk about. I suspect it's significantly busier in the summer, but really worth a little mooch about. So that brings us to the end of our tour of Harlech. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been an interesting day for me because I've never actually been here before. The castle is stunning, has an amazing cafe, definitely worth visiting. I wish that paraphernalia shop was open because I would be in there. They have a giant lassie dog in the window, so we might have to come back at some point.
Enough.
Anyway, I digress. Lovely place to visit, lots of beautiful shops and cafes and so on. The castle is lovely. You could walk or drive up Ffordd Penllech and make your own decisions as to whether it's the steepest or not. But thank you very much for watching, everybody. Diolch yn fawr am gwylio, and hopefully I'll see you again in another Miss HubNut video. Thank you. Bye. Hwyl fawr. And the street in New Zealand, which is called Dunedin, no, it's not called Dunedin Street, it's in Dunedin, isn't it? Dunedin.